Mr. Poon King Wang. Poon King Wang is the director of the Juan Yew Center for Innovative Cities at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, where he also heads the Smart Cities Labs and Future Digital Economies and Digital Societies initiatives. He is concurrently the Senior Director of Strategic Planning. King Wang is the World Economic Forum's expert network on cities and urbanizations, the board of Live with Artificial Intelligence, the international advisory panels of IoT Asia, and the National Task Force on the Future of Adult Learning. He was previously on the board of the BCA Center for Sustainable Building, co-director of ESSEC GTC, Industrial Infrastructures Innovation Center, and on the National Task Force on the Future-Ready Technologies for the Service and Digital Economy. His team is multidisciplinary research focused on the human dimensions of smart cities and digital economies, and the impact of digital transformations on the futures of work, education, and healthcare on the society at large. He pays particular attention to how leaders of cities and companies can design strategies and policies to live the lives of their citizens and workers with the same technologies that are disrupting work, economy, and society. He draws extensively from his public and private sector's experiences. He has served in the Economic Development Board, EDB, Ministry of Law, Agency for Science, Technology and Research, and the Competition Commission of Singapore. In the private sector, he was head of business analytics of Singapore's largest banks. Mr. King Wang holds MNCs from Stanford University in the US. That's a great pleasure to welcome you today for the opening lecture. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you for the very kind and comprehensive introduction, and thank you very much for having me here. A very good afternoon and a very warm welcome to Singapore. I was told that your theme for this presentation is transition, so I'm going to try my best to walk you through some ideas about what transitions we're facing, and most importantly, how to think about them. When I was asked to come talk, I couldn't say no because I have a soft spot for ESSEC. It was because of a chance introduction through ESSEC that 2 years ago I met the French community from Live with AI, Live with Artificial Intelligence, a French-Singapore think tank made out of the French community here. And the work that we've done together on the future of work has, as a result, just been recognized by Singapore as part of their national AI strategy about how do you build a trusted and progressive environment in the future of AI and a smart nation and a smart city. So whenever I get a request from a French community or from a French institution, I have to say yes, and I'll talk a little bit about how we were recognized by the national AI strategy in a very short while in the third part of my presentation. Transitions. So I'm going to talk through 3 stages of transitions. I'm going to walk you through 3 different types of transitions, from the very broad global perspective lens down to Singapore, and down to something very specific, which is about the future of work. Very topical at the moment, something that we're all trying to figure out what to do. At the same time, walking you through a different set of time frames. I'm going to stretch it a little bit. I'm not just going to start at 2020. I actually want to go back to 1950, because that gives us a nice 100 years. And the reason I like to do that is because very often in the nature of what we do, we find it's very important when you think about the future to also have a sense of where you come from. It's because you kind of need to know. And you need to know because then you know how to tackle the solutions and tackle the challenges. So let me just start by talking about the global transitions from 1950 and what we're going to see through 2050. I draw largely on the work that we've done previously that was published in a book in 2018. And I'm quite pleased to tell you that I think it's getting quite a bit of interest, because if you wish to read it in Korean, you now can. Right? And it was just translated by a Korean publisher and available at the beginning of this year. And I'm going to walk you through some of the work that we've done and how we think about global transitions. I want to let you know that global transitions, if you look at the 1950s, and for that matter, if you just take a step back and look at any country that was developing at a point in time, thinking about how to grow its economy, grow its society, grow its country, you find that at that point in time there were tremendously good intentions, a lot of good intentions starting out. We had many inclusive institutions. We expanded healthcare, expanded education. We We also had a rights revolution. More places had a vote, more females went out to work, or more females had more rights, and more people in society had opportunities. And the reason I want to talk about global transition is because how do we get from this, right, to the problems that we have today? You can actually draw a direct line and draw a connecting thread from those well-intentions to the challenges that we are facing today. This is what we traced out. Of course, history is much more complex, but let me just try to give you a proxy model for what happened. First off, what we found is that because of the inclusive institutions, as well as the rights revolution, we found that around the world, health improved, as well as in certain countries and in certain cities, technology development improved as well. This is interesting is because if you look at the data and the statistics, most countries got healthier before they got wealthier. It is possible, even with limited means, to make it possible for people to live well and to live healthily. This led to a few things that happened. With digital technologies and digital networks, technology globalized, and as a result, work was transformed. You not only had shifts within countries and cities and economies that went from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, you also saw globalization offshoring. And in large parts of Asia, especially in Singapore, with an export-oriented strategy, we took advantage of that, and as a result, we had a strong economy that grew. The health revolution, together with the transformation of work opportunities for a lot of people, plus the technologies that made health possible, resulted in a few things: a population explosion, as well as tremendous industrial activity. The challenges we are facing in the environment today is because we are all consuming and we're all producing, and in quantities and at a scale that's unprecedented in history. And the stresses that we have today came about because of the well-intentions that came along and the uplifting of lives that we had along the way. What happened next? As work was transformed, people started to become really good at what they do. You found that as economies and cities and countries transformed, they started to have these transformations and technologies where certain segments of society, certain segments of the economy seem to benefit more than others. As a result, you start to see divides. In some cases, those divides became inequalities. And very naturally, once a certain group starts to have some benefits, they want to say, well, maybe I want a little bit more of it for myself. They start to protect what they have. They try to make sure that they just not just protect what they have, they protect it for the next generation as well. And where we are today with the politics that we have today is as a result of that. And the tensions that we see today all started with very good intentions and all started with the uplifting of lives, and it's giving us all the challenges that we are today. This looking back at history and transitions is important, and this diagram is also important because I want you to keep this in mind as you think about the challenges you're going to help tackle, whether it's in the next 10, 20, 30 years. One is that no matter how smart and sharp your solutions will be, there's a good chance that there's a system behind it. Right? So as you think through the solutions, think about all the systemic implications and impact that you will need to be resolved in order to solve the challenges that you have today. Secondly, other reason I put this out is also because I think it's important to keep in mind that sometimes good intentions can lead to side consequences, can lead to outcomes that are not ideal, and so it pays to be very vigilant as you go about implementing these in society in the next 10, 20 years, that unintended consequences can come up, and what we need to do is to pay attention to those and to be on guard and stay true to what the intentions were and to shift course along the way. And the last thing that I think I wanted to raise is that through it all, no matter what you do, is always to bring people along for the ride. Somebody once asked me in any digital transformation, if I had to give you one KPI, what would it be? And I said that my KPI would be how many of your current citizens and current employees do you bring along with you for your digital transformation? And I think it's important to be inclusive, but it's also very easy to forget that. So in the work that we do, how do we make sure that we keep these things in mind, that as we implement ideas, provide ideas and do research, we are doing right by people and bringing them along? We came up with a sort of a pseudo equation that says that the minimum you need to think about is to think about these different dimensions. I will not go into this in great detail because I've actually reproduced this same equation onto the left-hand side here. And I'm going to just walk through a way of thinking about the future of work, right, as a way to demonstrate the efficacy and the value of thinking at least in these 5 dimensions. First off, why do we need to take into account the time dimension? We need to take into account the time dimension because even though whenever you listen to high-tech CEOs or even read the newspapers, they almost make it sound like disruption will happen overnight. You go to bed, it's not there. You wake up, it's there. It knocks you out, and then you become unconscious. It happens overnight. But usually, technology disruption doesn't happen that way. Sometimes it happens quickly. Sometimes it happens incrementally. I've been around long enough to know that the autonomous vehicles disruption has been taken at least 15 years to happen, and it's still not fully happening yet. So the important thing is, if you know a sense of how much time you have, you know how much you can plan, and you know what solutions you can design. Secondly, because of digital networks and digital technologies and how globally connected the world is, never mind there are trade wars and tariff wars at the moment, it's important to think in terms of scale. And why is it important to think in terms of scale? Because when you talk about, say, platform technologies that have a global reach, you're talking about an entire system that can benefit a lot of people, the top right-hand corner, for example, and those platforms are the ones that create a lot of wealth for a lot of people who are creating those platforms. But if you think about it, you can also break things down to the task level, to the gig level. And that's what you're seeing in the Uber drivers, the delivery drivers. And for them, the scale at which they're operating is a very different thing. The scale they're not talking about is a global one. They're talking about what that gig work does for them and whether they're being treated right. And these things coexist. And so it's important to think through what is the scale of the solution and the challenge you're thinking about. Using the gig workers as well gives you a good example of what tech is. It gives you a good example of what the next dimension think about is important, which is about tech. It's very easy to get excited about what tech is. AI is great, or Python, you have to learn it. But it's more important to think a little bit, given that digital technologies are multi-purpose, general purpose, right, what it does. So the gig worker who is doing a gig work, doing an Uber driver, to actually earn a decent income, has a very different set of considerations and use of the technology from somebody in Singapore, for example, who we know who does driving only on the weekends because he's earning extra income to pay for the house that's going to come over the horizon in the next 1 year or so. The two circumstances are different, and it's important to keep in mind how different people are using tech and what it means for them. As we bring people along for transitions, we like to think in terms of cost-benefit analysis. And we actually recommend and advise that if you want to bring people along, don't just think in terms of cost-benefit analysis, think in terms of the human causes that matter as well. In some jobs, people are not in it for the money, they are in it because they care about making a difference in the world. Healthcare and nurses is a good example, education is another one. And if you don't factor these things in as you think about what you need to do when you transition, you're going to lose some things along the way. And lastly, as I've pointed out, all these issues are societal-wide. And so it's not useful just to think about whether it's the public sector's job or the private sector's job or even the individual citizen's responsibility. We need to start thinking about how you bring everybody together and to move the community along all at the same time. So that's global transitions. That's just to give you a frame in which to think about what has happened the last 50 years and is likely to continue happening for the next few decades. In a nutshell, and let me now zoom in to a little bit about Singapore, to see how Singapore has responded during that same time period and how we've transitioned from where we were, right, to where we are today as you see around and you go out to visit the city. Singapore started this way. These were pictures from the 50s and the 60s. This was after World War II, and we were dealing with a bunch of differences and riots and unrest. The left-hand side is actually, the one with a red border is actually anti-colonial riots against the British. The one in the middle is actually communist riots between the communists and the non-communists. Top left, right-hand corner is actually race riots between different racial groups and different ethnic groups. And this picture in the middle is actually a terrorist bombing that happened because of regional tensions, different countries around the region not being quite happy with what was going on in Singapore. And all this was happening in the context of Singapore having a population where the majority of the population were not born here. They came from southern India, they came mostly from southern China, they came from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and they did not feel that they had a place here. So if anything happened, this was just a place to earn a living. If it didn't work out, they'll go somewhere else. So how do you build a country and how do you transition a country from being purely about immigrants who had no stake here, just here for economic opportunity, transitioning to something that actually they say, you know what, maybe there's something here that I would like to fight for. And a major and important part of that equation and the policy was not just about economic growth and making sure that people kept earning money all the time, which was important, but also think a little bit about the social housing, the public housing, and the social circumstances. This is a shop house from the 1960s and 50s. It's in the middle part of Singapore, but this is where most people lived. I know because my father and my grandparents stayed in this shop house exactly. And they lived on the topmost floor, not because it was the most expensive and prestigious, but in the days before elevators, the topmost floor was the cheapest. And they stayed right in the middle, because why? Not because it was the most private, because right in the middle there were no windows, no light, so the darkest one and on the tallest floor was the cheapest one. And my father used to tell me that he would lie on the floor at night, waiting to sleep, and he could actually feel rats running over his feet. So these are the circumstances that a lot of people are living in at that point in time. These shop houses now look like this on the left-hand side. It's obviously gentrified. They're all now pubs and clubs and nice places you can have a nice drink. But I want to point out right at the back is what I want to pay a lot of attention to. The tall block of public buildings that you see there is actually Singapore's most eminent example of the quality of public housing that is provided for the Singapore population. In Singapore, 80% of the population lives in public housing. And now the 80% that lives in public housing, 90% actually own the houses that they live in, the flats that they live in. And if you look at the picture on the right, if I were to ask you which is private housing and which public housing, you probably can just make out, right? That the one with a lot of glass looks like private housing. The one on the right has a bit less glass is public housing. But you can also see that the difference is not great. And is the ability to provide somebody with a strong public housing policy so that they feel that if anything happens, that this is the place in which they have a stake and this is a place that they will fight and actually try to make a future. At the same time, these public housings are places where different races, different communities, different ethnic groups mix. So you get to learn to live with each other and you get to realize that, you know what, that person might be different race or different ethnicity from me, but actually he's quite a good guy and they are a good family and you learn to get along with each other. You may still make some jokes every now and then, this happens everywhere, but at least you've learned to get along. In the space of this 1 week, I don't think many of you will have opportunities to actually go visit a public housing. You might hear about it, but you probably won't visit it. So what I have is actually a short 3-4 minute video about a Japanese couple who decided that they wanted to learn a little bit more about public housing in Singapore after being here for 15 years and being not quite sure that public housing was what they wanted. So let me just get this going. HDB stands for the government body, the Housing Development Board that actually builds our public flats. And about 2 years ago, they celebrated building the 1 million flat for Singaporeans. Right, so let me just get this video going.
It looks very rigid and looks simulated. So because we are like kind of artists, don't know, we were not very sure, but living in one of them. And then some of the friends that is working as art teachers, they invited us for their flats that we bought and live with it. The interiors was quite amazing because it's outside looks all the same, but inside completely different. We are from Japan and other foreigners that they interested like in flat in Singapore. They're easier to accept that, okay, so you are interested in the Singapore culture. But then it's, why don't you come in? So most of the people, maybe 80% of people that we knock on the door, they say okay to come in and shoot at the spot. We really confirm that this country is safe country, because we can just let us, go in like we are strangers, and we talk and have exchange contact, and that was quite really amazing.
Some of them took us to the Foca Center nearby, introducing their favorite food. So it was really actually very joyful journey. When we came to Singapore, one of the comments we hear quite often was there's no culture in Singapore. We want to prove wrong. By making this into the book, we have almost like access to all these different type of houses, so that even treasure of Singapore.
Okay, so maybe you can try walk into one of those public flats tonight and say, I'm from France and I want to learn more. Would you let me into your house, right? Maybe you could try that. Okay, so upgrading the living environment, using it as a social policy tool and not just a public housing tool, was one way that we were able to transition, not just as an economically slightly more advanced economy, but as a society that we find something to come together to include everybody, and which also gives you a chance and a fillip in life so that you have a roof over your head. At the same time, housing is just one part of a larger equation about how Singapore has transitioned. And if you look at the things that we've done in the physical living environment to make it more sustainable and livable, you find that there are three elements that's always present. It's always integrated, combining different disciplines, combining different government departments, different policies. It's always an imaginative solving of problem, and it's always inclusive. Let me give you three examples from using these three pictures. The one on the top right-hand side is actually a park in the northeast part of Singapore, but you see parks like this all around Singapore. The idea was to actually make Singapore a green, so-called garden in the city, and now if you look at the satellite picture, about 40% of the cover over a city is actually green cover. And the decision to actually create all these parks and greenery and trees was actually started in the 1960s. That was actually a cabinet-level decision, so one of the jokes was that it's probably the only cabinet in the world that had to read a flowers and grass report as part of the cabinet meetings. And the whole idea was to keep the city cool, but also to provide livable parks and spaces and green spaces for people living all around the parks. On the left-hand side is an example of another park, but this time I'm showing you a bridge that goes to the park. And why is that? Why am I showing you a bridge that's going to the park? It's because actually where they're walking to used to be a landfill from the 1970s to the 1990s. Then for 20 years, they rehabilitated it. It's now a wetland. And if there's any indication that it's a pretty place and pretty good place to go to is if you're prepared to have your wedding photos taken there and to make that place Insta-worthy, I think it's a good way that you actually make use of your land and to free up land and make it usable for everybody and to make a livable environment. And the bottom right-hand side is actually raindrops. Singapore is a small city. One of the things that happened to us was when we became independent in 1965, we did not have our own water supply, only a little bit. Most of our water supply came from our northern neighbors. And when we became independent, the northern neighbors said, if you ever don't behave yourself as a country, the smallest country in the region, we'll just turn off the taps. And so Singapore decided it was a geopolitical decision. We also had to provide enough water for industrial as well as home use and domestic use. And so we decided that because we're in a part of the world where we had heavy monsoon storms, we did a calculation and realized that if we collected every drop of water that fell on Singapore's land, we have enough water for both industry needs as well as domestic needs. And so in the space of 40, 50 years, we've gone from 3 reservoirs to 17 reservoirs. We've gotten to a point where all the water that's being used that goes into the system is also actively recycled. And it's a 100-year plan from 1965 to 2061 for us to become self-sufficient in water so that we will always be able to depend on ourselves and the climate and the weather for our water needs. So how do you get enough water? You collect every drop of water. Again, started in the 1960s. And everybody got involved because we all have to learn to conserve and save water at the same time at our homes. So the combination of all these things, housing, parks, water bodies for recreation, etc., is a neighborhood like this that's in the western part of Singapore. And you see that all the houses are built around public amenities, public infrastructure, public transport, access to private transport as well. And the whole idea is that no matter what your social and economic circumstances are, you will not be denied, you will not be at a disadvantage when it comes to accessing the public amenities, public transport, and public infrastructure. That's such a large part of making good quality of living in Singapore a possibility. Now, I give you these examples of Singapore's transition because these are usually beyond the economic headline numbers. These are more the social issues. But they're so important in understanding Singapore's economic structure in the years ahead. One of the topics that's getting quite a lot of debate in Singapore, but all around the world, is this whole idea of inequality. Oh, sorry, before I go there. Besides the physical infrastructure, there's also the upgrading of human capabilities and human health, which I talked about earlier. So in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, up to early 90s, we actually had programs in schools to make sure that children were healthy. So milk was provided at a subsidized rate to all the children if they wanted to purchase at a subsidized rate. And in order to make sure that our teeth were healthy, good dental hygiene, all of us had to learn to brush our teeth squatting beside a drain. I know because I was one of those who actively bought milk. Looks like it turned out all right? The milk was of pretty good quality. And I was one of those who had to learn to brush my teeth squatting by a drain as well. And it's strange, the drains are smelly, right? But you always had a favorite spot, right? You had a favorite spot to brush your teeth, and you always try to get your favorite spot every day. We continue to invest in people. So now we've moved beyond, of course, providing milk and making sure you brush your teeth. We've gone to making sure that our students, our next generation is digitally savvy, that we have good teachers for them. We invest in technology, invest in teaching education. At the same time, as our population ages, we're also investing in healthcare facilities, such that we have what we call a healthcare or community ecosystem, so that people who are aging and they want to age in place in their own neighborhoods with all their friends are able to do so and have access to healthcare facilities. Right, so I talk about all this. This is something I want to touch on. I talk about all this because it's important as you think a little bit about economic challenges that Singapore will face down the road. One of them is, of course, the potential risk of inequality that we're seeing in various parts around the world, including in Singapore. And while you have indices like the Gini coefficient, at least in Singapore, it's important to keep in mind that some of these calculations do not take into account some of the things that I just talked about, which is the subsidized housing and the subsidized infrastructure that Singaporean citizens have access to. And of course, the overall taxation philosophy that says that we want to keep taxation low so that middle-class families will have something that they can invest in their children for the future, while at the same time being able to provide high-quality healthcare and high-quality education systems. These transitions are so important to keep in mind as you talk a little bit about Singapore's major strategies for tomorrow. You might hear about two of them in the course of this 1 week. One of them is, of course, Smart Nation, which is Singapore's version of a smart city strategy. The difference is that for most smart cities, smart city is a way to transform your urban services, usually the municipal services. In Singapore, it's just not a way to transform your municipal services, it's also a way to transform the economy and to try to bring about a stronger community. And the sponsorship for this project, the support of this project comes right all the way from the top, which is initiated by the Prime Minister himself. And again, these smart nations built on a long history of investments over the decades to try to make sure that constantly we're improving and opening up possibilities to improve people's lives. The next major initiative that we need to deal with is the environment and climate change. And this was just announced last year that we think this is a 50 to 100 year investment. And Singapore is prepared to invest about $100 billion over the next 50 to 100 years to protect Singapore against rising sea levels and more broadly, to keep it sustainable and to tackle climate change. So keep these in mind as you think a little bit about the transitions of where Singapore has come from and where it's going, that these will have to be all considered in its totality as a system, as I talked a little bit about in the global transitions. And as you think about the challenges, the solutions, and how you want to resolve some of these issues, you have to think in terms of the different moving parts and the interdependencies as well. Okay, so that was Singapore in the context of the global transitions, but with a clear lens, very deep insight lens on the social transitions, the infrastructure transitions, and about how to improve people's lives. Now I want to move a little bit to be more forward-looking, to talk about the future of work. Here we're drawing largely on the work that we do in the research center, where we've actually built up quite a body of research and quite interesting work in the future of work. The problem with a lot of future of work reports is that they give you a lot of predictions. So many jobs will be destroyed, so many jobs will be created. And at some point, it's not very helpful because, as one MIT Technology Review article says, there are as many predictions of destruction as there are predictions of job creation. And the conclusion was that it was all over the place and there was no consensus. And so we've been spending the last 4 or 5 years thinking through how do we get some consensus and how to get a concrete way forward. And let me give you a clue of what that is. The clue is this, no artificial intelligence needed, no special technologies needed, just do a Control F on these two PDF documents, and you look at the word count of the word task, skill, and job. And while task is still smaller than skill and job, you can actually see that it's the only growth industry and the growth sector amongst all three words. And the reality is that the future of work needs to be thought about at the task level. It's not longer enough just to talk about jobs and skills, you need to talk about tasks as well. And the simple way to think about it is that jobs are being transformed and disrupted, not job by job, but task by technology. And the way we have built our research is to say that if skills provide a map, then actually task provides the GPS. This built on not just our research in the Juan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, but builds on global research that over time has increasingly recognized that tasks are central. They used to be the same as skills, but not anymore. How do we know it's not the same anymore? As if you've gone for job interviews, if you say, I know Python or I'm creative, chances are interviewer will ask you, can you give me an example? People are now interested not just in what skill you have, but what you've actually done with the skill. And what you do with the skill is actually the task. And so over time, the last 15 years, and especially in the last 5 years, the academic research has advanced to a point where they recognize that task is not just central to understanding where skills are changing, globalization is changing, but also useful, have strong explanation powers for understanding how the labor market has changed in the last 20 to 30 years. And so using this very simple idea about tasks, we've actually built an entire body of research that's getting quite a lot of interest, both in Singapore as well as globally. Let me just illustrate very quickly how we use very simple ideas in the use of tasks. Every job that you have, in this case, information security analyst, every job can be broken down into its constituent tasks, which is the dots you see on the left-hand side. If you can assess, right, which of these tasks will be disrupted and when they'll be disrupted, which is the axis you see on the dots, you get a good sense of the speed and scale of disruption, even the shape of the disruption. You know how much time you have to help somebody whose jobs might be affected and what you need to do to help them. At the same time, every job has tasks that are similar to the tasks in some other jobs. Usually it's like that. And so what you get is by looking at which tasks are shared and similar, you get a good sense of which other jobs this person could move to in the event that his job is being disrupted. And then after that, all you need to do is just repeat what I just explained to you. In each of these jobs that they can move to, you can also get a sense of which tasks in those jobs are being disrupted, when are they being disrupted, and what you get is a sense of which are the riskier or safer jobs that a person can move to. So what I've just shown you is a way to show how you can transition people whose jobs are being displaced. You can use it to track disruption. And most importantly, of the tasks that remain, the tasks that are not disrupted, you can actually then choose to invest in the technologies that make those jobs more valuable and more meaningful. And then, of course, you can redesign the jobs and create a new job out of it. So this is what we've done. This is the work that went into the National AI Strategy. It was recognized by a National AI Strategy. It's with the French think tank Live with AI, together with a French AI consultancy called Data Robot, together 8 different companies. We look at 8 occupations, professional occupations across 4 industries to show that it's versatile across different occupations and industries. And what we did here was on the left-hand side, what you see is all the tasks that a particular job has. We assess when it will be disrupted, what percentage of it will be disrupted. You get a sense of how much time you have and what you need to do. On the right-hand side is where we start factoring in the social, ethical, and regulatory considerations. And most importantly, right over here, you see, we also ask, should we be using the technology to augment human beings? Or should we leave a certain task in the hands of human beings because it's just so important as part of the human experience? Most innovative part is we actually also decided to ask the employees, what do you find most valuable about your job? And this is important because when we actually asked the managers, they actually said, oh, just automate everything that's routine, dirty, dull, dangerous, and that's the common narrative. But when we actually asked the data scientists, he said, oh, please don't automate all my dirty, dull, dangerous, and routine jobs. Because my day is quite intense, and what I do need routine stuff, mundane stuff as soakers in the day, and that helps to make sure that my day is not intense. And once we do that in the occupational psychology literature, you find that actually those jobs, for example, such as in healthcare, if you don't have these buffers where you soak up the intensity of the day, the job becomes quite stressful and becomes quite unbearable for the professional as well. And so with that in mind, you actually have what we call a one-page roadmap to the future of how your jobs can be transformed and how you can actually not just transform it, but also make sure that it's human-centric and it's done in a way that is consistent with what you believe is a future job should be, that should be meaningful and valuable for your employees. The other piece of work that we did was with the unions. In some cases, the job cannot be transformed. So what we do is you have to transition the person to another job. And so what the unions gave us was 6 jobs that were at risk on the left-hand side. And you remember, most jobs will share similar tasks, and you can use that to find new pathways. We use a very simple AI algorithm to actually then, using similar tasks, we found these potential new jobs that have shared similar tasks with the jobs that are at risk. At the same time, these jobs that you can move to would have tasks that are not similar to the displaced job. These tasks then become the tasks to be trained. And what you have now is a roadmap to the future, to multiple possibilities for the employee. So what I have as a building block, again, as a second building block, is actually what I call a transition pathway, and is tangible and targeted. You know specifically which tasks you need to train in, what you need to train in. Chances are training time is reduced, it's more effective, more efficient, and your ROI will go up. Most importantly, most of the other literature out there, most of the other reports out there will show you how to transition a job. They tend to stay within the same sector and the profession. What we have here is we show how you can transition to jobs outside your profession, outside the sector as well. So you just expand the possibilities. You also just make your labor market more porous and more flexible. Very often when we use tasks, we are told that, tasks can be dehumanizing, a bit like scientific management, Taylorism. Are you dehumanizing the future of work for us? And I say, no, we're not. The difference is that in most of those previous cases, they broke down the work into tasks and they left it at that. Here we are reconstructing, only to reconstruct and to rehumanize into opportunities for people who might be affected by technology disruption. And the versatility means that we can go from the left to the right. I can also start with a vision of where the future job could be, and work backwards to say, how do we get the people from today's jobs to tomorrow's vision of what the future jobs would be. Most importantly, we met one union leader who said that actually he thinks that we can use this to change mindsets. So if you look at the top occupation, which is bus driver, you find that one of the potential options you move to is actually a pilot. And you might say, oh no, is that even possible? Is that a bit far-fetched? So what the union leader said, no, it doesn't matter whether it's far-fetched or not. What I need to do is I actually need to cover the word pilot. Then I'll ask the bus driver and his manager, do you think you could do these tasks? And if the bus driver and manager says, yes, I think I can, you do the big review and say, actually, these are some of the tasks of a pilot. You're more capable than you've given yourself credit for. And by doing that, I've given you a tangible way to change mindsets. And then I thought this was just a hypothetical example. About 2 months ago, I met the director of a division in a high-tech company. He said, oh, it's not hypothetical at all. In his previous company, his boss's driver actually did become a pilot. So it is possible. But it's just that we've been trapped by our own mentalities and thinking about what is doable. So overall, by making it tasks being very specific, very targeted, I've actually increased certainty for workers. By giving you options outside your conventional profession and sector, we are actually giving you more confidence, and the combination of it means that I can give you a little bit more hope about tomorrow, and that you have opportunities coming your way, no matter what are the disruptive or technology transformations that are coming your way. So, to sum up this future of work bit, it's important. This is something that we wrote that was translated and actually published in ESSEC Business School. And actually, we emphasize a lot that when you bring people along, you must remember what they are good in, not just the mind versus not the mind, but really human capabilities, the things that we care about. And so keep that in mind as you think about how you want to transition, transform, or make changes in decisions that actually affect a lot of people. So with that, let me conclude. Big theme of what we do is about bringing people along, always remembering to bring people along. And I find it useful to think about is just what are some of the challenges and difficulties that we all face, and maybe think about how to use technology, policy, and other initiatives to solve them. And hopefully today, in my presentation, I've given you 3 ways to think about this. In the global transitions, the thing that we forgot was we've got to bring some people along with us. And keep that in mind, let's keep doing that together. In Singapore, what we've always done so far, I hope we continue to do so, you never know, right, is always integrated policies, integrated initiatives, always try to be imaginative about how you solve problems, and always be inclusive. And lastly, in the work that we do on the future of work, start thinking in terms of tasks, because they are a modular building block. They're also highly concrete and tangible. And most importantly, I've given you an example how you can actually humanize the whole process and humanize the future for a lot of people out there. So with that, I end my presentation and be happy to take any questions that you might have for the remaining, I think, 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Wang. Yes, we have time for questions and to have a conversation with the first source. If someone wants to start the Q&A session. Maybe I have one. I want to go back to
Yes.
the difference from the union, actually.
Yes, yeah.
Because it looks like many among the family, it looks like instead of undergo transitions, is to be more proactive about transition. So if you are in that category,
Yes.
how you have to train yourself in order to become someone else. The question behind is, who is responsible for that? Is that government who is responsible for that? Is the union responsible for that? As you know that we have a lot of strikes in France.
Yes.
And it's not really China, but not just about that. The Yellow Vest movement, for instance, was about what is our future.
Yep.
And I was wondering who is responsible for that and how it works.
So if you remember in my global transitions, I talked about my pseudo equation with the 5 dimensions. And I actually said that we are at a stage where a lot of our issues that we are facing, in this case, the future of work, is now beyond the province of any public sector, private sector, or individual to settle. So we kind of need to work together on this. So let me give Singapore as an example. One is that the government has actually made it quite clear that they hope to move our workers and to transition our workers. And they've gotten the unions on board to do this together with them. Secondly, what they do is they provide government incentives and policies to try to encourage businesses to do so. So one example of a policy that we put in place this year is that if you, as a private sector company, get a government grant to do your so-called digital transformation, from this March onwards, when you get the grant, you have to spell out what will happen to your employees and how your employees will benefit. The value of doing that is that if you just leave it to the market decisions and to business decisions, the easiest thing to do is just lop off the heads, right? And to cut manpower costs. But by making this explicit, it's both sending a signal, plus as well as sending an incentive to the companies to do right. And you find that at least in the last 1-2 years, companies have been telling us that, yes, when they try to transform, they're trying to bring everybody along. I'm not sure whether this will continue because after 1-2 years, maybe an economic downturn might come. But as of now, it seems to be working, and most people are going along and being brought along for the journey. There's also the responsibility of the individual. What the Singapore government has done is they have something called Skills Future. I understand you're implementing something similar in France, where everybody is given 500 credits to actually take courses according to a pre-approved list that you can pick. It's quite a large number of courses you can take. And the idea is that you take responsibility for your own learning and your own lifelong learning to keep improving. Again, early days of that, A lot of people have not used their Skills Future credits yet, but at the same time, it's a starting point, and it's an impetus and a push to get people to start to get into the habit of learning, to upgrade themselves, and to always keep striving to transform themselves and to strive better for something in the future.
Any question? No question.
Oh, yes. Yes, yeah.
So you mentioned the efficiency of public housing here in Singapore, and I was wondering to what extent this model is specific to Singapore, and if you think it can be further transferable to other countries.
we get that question a lot. I think at the moment it's unique to Singapore. But at the same time, if you look at its history, where we are today is obviously many decades of finessing the policy, finessing the building, the finessing the initiatives go with it. But where we started, we pretty much started almost like every other country in the world, where we had to see where we need to get, how to acquire the land, to build that up. At the same time, how do you ensure that to provide high quality building codes and regulations to do that? And secondly, how do you create incentives, right, so that people will actually find the means to actually purchase a flat of their own. So one thing I did not have time to go into, but I'll go into in this Q&A session, is that when the public housing scheme was first started, affordability remained an issue because most of them were immigrant workers working on ports, construction sites, not a lot of money there. And what Singapore had at that time was what we call our equivalent of our social security, which is what we call CPF, a Central Provident Fund. Every month you have to set aside a certain amount of money that goes into social security. And of course, what happens with social security is if you don't do anything, it's until you retire before you can touch the finances. So somewhere in the late 60s, what they decided to do was they said, well, why don't we do this? You can actually use whatever's in your social security to actually then pay some part of your public housing. And on top of that, the government will provide subsidized loans for you, right, so that it will make it easy for you and finance a low-cost, low-interest loan for about 20 to 30 years. And so that combination of building of the infrastructure, the combination of creating livable environments around the public housing so that people actually want to go into those public housing, a little bit of coercion, admittedly, because we had to take back the land, and some of those lands belonged to people who lived on farms, and so they no longer had farms with large pieces of land, but then in return, they got a flat in return. And then, of course, the financial incentives and the financial schemes that went with it. The combination, right, the systemic integration of different parts of it made it possible. So as to whether any other country can do it, I think you just need to look at these few ingredients and see whether you can get started that way. And if you can, at least you're at the beginnings of a public housing program. Yes.
I have a question in relation to the tasks issue. More and more we are talking about soft skills,
Yes.
Versus hard skills.
Yeah.
And I was wondering in your studies, how does that reflect, and especially for the type of jobs that you show on the screen, how the soft skills can be evaluated, considered, and maybe sometimes go to the future of jobs or transition of jobs.
Yes.
Go from one job to another that has absolutely technically nothing to do with the initial job, but relies on the same type of soft skills.
Yes, so the soft skills also can be distilled into a task. So you take one of those soft skills called communication skills, which everybody says is very important now. And I always felt it was always important, maybe it's now just more important. But the reality is that if you're working in the government, working as a marketing person, working as a lawyer, or working as a teacher, the communication skills that you need are actually going to be different, right? if you try to communicate to students like you're communicating to the government bureaucrats, you'll probably lose the students within the first 5 minutes, right? And vice versa. So even for something like a soft skill, we find that it's extremely important to be specific to say how you're applying that communication skill to, and that usually requires you to translate it into a task, which once you translate into a task makes it easier for you to train, because then I can actually set up, let's say in a school, I can set a course of communications in the public sector, or communicating to your citizens versus communicating to students. And once you do that, I think what you have is a greater granularity and clarity about how exactly you need to train people for different sectors and spheres of their professional lives.
Actually, it gives me another question, which is, for example, you're mentioning teacher.
Yes.
A teacher 10 years ago and a teacher 10 years from now, it's the same job, but actually the environment we have changed so much that the job itself could be considered as a different job.
Yes.
In your study, how did you take into consideration this type of job that on the paper doesn't change the title, but because of the environment change, can really be very different?
Yeah, so it still boils back down to, for example, just take something as simple as using slides. And then I'm going to draw it over a longer time frame. I went to school when teachers were still using overhead projectors. I don't think anybody in the room knows what that is. Some of us do, right? They got OHP or overhead projectors. Everything was on a plastic film. You wrote on a plastic film using a marker, you flashed it, and then it was projected on the screen. Today, you can use a PowerPoint, right? And so going down to that is still essentially the same job, almost similar. It looks on paper the same job, but the task that you've actually have to perform has actually changed. At the same time, if you look at something more near time, closer in time frame, in the last 10, 20 years in Singapore, the classroom used to be a place where the teacher disseminated. It was mostly one way. The teacher gives you the knowledge, the students are supposed to receive. And then now teachers are expected to actually facilitate the discussion and try to get the students to actually do some background research and to do the facilitate discussion. So the 1 hour class remains the same, but the task that the teacher has to do has changed, and as a result, and as a consequence, the skills has to evolve as well.
Thank you very much for your talk. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you.